Hello, and welcome back to Hope is Kindled, where stories, history, philosophy, and the human heart come together to search for light, even when the darkness feels absolute. Tonight's episode is different. It has never been harder, perhaps it has never felt harder, to look for hope than it is in night. This is not a book that reassures. It does not comfort. It does not soften what must be faced. And if we are honest, any easy talk of hope here would feel like a betrayal, not only of the text, but of the people whose suffering it bears witness to. And yet, if hope is kindled means anything at all, it means we do not look away. We listen. We stay. And we search, not for optimism, but for truth that can still guide us. Tonight, we sit with night. To understand this, we must begin with the world that made it possible. We could devote entire courses, years of study, to Holocaust literature, and still only begin to grasp its depth, its weight, and its moral urgency. These works are not a niche of history or a sidebar of suffering. They are foundational texts for understanding the modern world, the collapse of ethics, the dangers of obedience, and the terrifying speed with which ordinary life can become unrecognizable. Holocaust literature shapes how we understand power, memory, responsibility, and the fragility of civilization itself. It should be intrinsic to our identities as readers, citizens, and human beings, not as an abstract lesson, but as a living moral inheritance. And yet, precisely because it is taught, assigned, and revisited, we must never take it for granted. Familiarity must never dull reverence. Repetition must never breed comfort. Each return to these texts demands humility, attentiveness, and the willingness to be unsettled again, because remembrance is not passive, it is an act of vigilance. Elie Wiesel was deported from Siet, a small Jewish community in Transylvania, during the final phase of the Holocaust, when the machinery of extermination was already fully operational. The camps were no longer experiments. They were systems. Efficient. Industrial. Relentless. What makes night especially devastating is not only the cruelty it documents, but the speed with which normal life collapses. Neighbors disappear. Laws change overnight. Warnings are dismissed. The unimaginable becomes routine. This is a history not only of violence, but of indifference. Nations knew. Borders closed. Bureaucracy outpaced mercy. In this context, hope cannot mean rescue. Rescue did not come in time. Hope, instead, becomes something smaller and more severe. The decision to survive long enough to remember what happened when the world looked away. Elie Wiesel did not intend night to be literature. Originally written in Yiddish, as Und die Welt hat geschwiegen, the world remains silent, the manuscript was far longer, angrier, more explicit. It was later cut, pared down, and translated into the restrained form we now know. That restraint is not aesthetic. It is ethical. Wiesel believed that excess language risked distorting truth. Silence, gaps, understatement, these were not absences. They were acknowledgments of what could not be fully spoken. After the war, Wiesel carried a double burden. The burden of survival and the burden of testimony. He often said that the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. Night is his lifelong refusal to allow indifference to win. Hope, for Wiesel, did not mean faith restored. It meant memory preserved. Psychologically, Night is one of the most honest accounts of trauma ever written. Wiesel does not portray himself as heroic. He shows us fear, resentment, exhaustion, even moments of shame. He records the horrifying truth that extreme deprivation can fracture moral instincts, not because people are evil, but because survival can become all-consuming. This honesty is essential. Trauma is not dramatic. It is grinding, repetitive, disorienting. Identity erodes slowly, through hunger, humiliation, and the constant threat of death. And yet, something endures. Psychologically, hope in night is not optimism. It is continuity of self, the fragile thread of awareness that says, I am still here. I am still watching. I will remember this. Even when faith in God falters, the act of bearing witness remains. That act, remembering when forgetting would be easier, is the deepest form of psychological resistance. Throughout Hope is Kindled, we have encountered many forms of hope. In the Odyssey, hope is endurance shaped by homecoming. In Frankenstein, Hope fails when responsibility is abandoned. In A Wrinkle in Time, hope is love chosen under fear. In Always Coming Home, hope is continuity without conquest. Night Stands Apart. Here, hope does not arrive as transformation. It arrives as testimony. Like Dostoevsky, Wiesel understands that suffering does not automatically ennoble. Unlike Dickens, there is no guaranteed redemption arc. And unlike Orwell, Wiesel does not imagine a warning future. He records a lived catastrophe. Yet, Night belongs with these works because it shares a crucial conviction: that the human spirit is not measured by victory, but by refusal to surrender meaning. If other books ask how we live, Night asks why we must remember. And memory, here, is hope's final form. It has never been harder to look for hope than it is in Night. And yet, once we find it, in survival, in remembrance, in witness, it becomes one of the most serious and enduring forms of hope we know. Not hope that comforts. Not hope that promises rescue. But hope that insists. This mattered. That insistence is what keeps us human. What this book refuses to do, Night, does not offer redemption arcs. It does not promise that suffering makes us better. It does not wrap atrocity in meaning. Elie Wiesel writes with an almost unbearable restraint. The prose is spare because excess would be dishonest. The horror speaks for itself. This is not a book about faith being restored. It is a book about faith being shattered again and again. Children are murdered. Families are broken. Human beings are reduced to numbers. God is questioned, accused, sometimes abandoned entirely. If hope exists here, it will not arrive as belief. Why hope is so difficult to find here, we need to say this plainly. There are moments in Night where hope appears to die. When the world proves indifferent. When cruelty becomes routine. When survival itself begins to demand moral compromise. Wiesel does not hide this. He records the moment when a son abandons his father. The moment when prayer feels empty. The moment when survival threatens to hollow out the soul. And this honesty is essential. Because false hope that denies reality is not hope at all. It is evasion. Where hope actually lives in Night, so where do we find it? Not in miracles. Not in rescue. Not in justice delivered on time. Hope in Night lives in something quieter, more fragile, and far more demanding. Elie Wiesel's refusal to give up. He survives. He endures. He remembers. And most importantly, he bears witness. There are moments when the will to live is almost extinguished. When hunger, exhaustion, and despair conspire to erase the self. And yet, Wiesel keeps going, not because he believes the world is good, but because to stop would mean surrendering the last thing the Nazis could not fully take from him, his humanity. That is hope, not as comfort, but as resistance. Survival as moral action in many works we've explored on hope is Kindled. Hope appears as transformation or redemption. Here, hope is something starker. Hope is survival without forgetting. Wiesel does not survive to move on. He survives to remember. He survives to testify. In that sense, survival itself becomes an ethical act. To live is to say, this mattered. To write is to say, this must not be erased. The Nazis sought not only to kill bodies, but to annihilate memory. Night stands in direct opposition to that goal. This is where hope becomes inward. Looking inward, when the world has failed, there is a moment late in Night when Elie looks at himself in a mirror, after liberation, and barely recognizes the face staring back. That moment is devastating. And yet, the fact that he looks, that he names what he sees, that he tells us, sees itself, an act of hope. Because hope here is not belief in goodness. It is fidelity to truth. It is the decision to remain human when the world has abandoned humanity. This aligns with one of the deepest through lines of hope is Kindled. That when external structures collapse, when institutions, ideologies, even faith itself fail, the last refuge of hope is the inner decision not to surrender one's moral awareness. Why Night became a cornerstone for us, you ask? We return to Night not because it makes us feel better, but because it makes us more honest. In a world still capable of cruelty, still prone to forgetting, Wiesel's voice insists that memory is not optional. Remembering is a responsibility. Hope, here, is not the promise that suffering will be redeemed. Hope is the insistence that suffering will be remembered. That is why this book has become one of our cornerstones. Because hope does not always look like light breaking through darkness. Sometimes it looks like a single voice refusing to be silenced. What Night asks of us, Night does not ask us to admire Elie Wiesel. It asks us to listen to him. It asks us to carry what we've heard into our own lives, to resist indifference, to notice when language becomes dehumanizing, to remember that cruelty begins long before violence does. And perhaps most importantly, it asks us to understand that hope is not something we feel, it is something we choose. To remember, to speak, to remain human. Closing it has never been harder to find hope than it is in Night. And yet, once we find it, in endurance, in memory, in witness, it becomes one of the most serious forms of hope we know. Not hope that promises things will be okay, but hope that insists. This mattered. And that insistence changes us. Before we close, there is something that must be said plainly, without hedging and without apology. Antisemitism is not a difference of opinion. Genocidal hatred is not context. And the ideology that led to the Holocaust was not a misunderstanding, it was a crime against humanity. At Hope is Kindled, we state this clearly and without exception. We stand with our Jewish friends, our Jewish families, and our Jewish neighbors, always. We do not condone, excuse, or tolerate hatred in any form. We reject antisemitism, racism, ethnic hatred, and any ideology that seeks to dehumanize people based on who they are. We condemn violence and discrimination wherever they appear, whether overt or disguised as rhetoric, debate, or historical revision. Nazism was, and remains, a moral obscenity. The individuals and systems that carried out crimes against the Jewish people committed acts of unspeakable evil. Those crimes are not softened by time, and they are not diminished by denial, deflection, or false equivalence. Remembering Night means remembering why remembrance matters. Because genocide does not begin with camps. It begins with language, with indifference, with the slow normalization of hatred. We reject that path completely. Hope is Kindled exists to affirm the dignity of the human spirit, to resist cruelty, and to insist, again and again, that every life has value. That commitment includes standing firmly against antisemitism and against all ideologies that traffic in dehumanization. There is no room here for hate, no room for excuses, and no room for forgetting. Thank you for walking with me through this difficult ground. Good journey.